Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for taking the time to join me online in this pre-recorded webinar. This webinar was actually a live webinar that took place at the end of July, and we decided to re-record it and post it online for folks to view at a later time. My name is Savannah Katulski, and I'm a livestock extension agent on the island of Kauai. And we're going to go over some basics for selecting replacement heifers for your beef herd. So there's always two schools of thought when it comes to replacement heifers for a cow-calf operation, and it's whether you choose to purchase your replacement heifers or raise your own replacement heifers. Um, it's really important at the very beginning to evaluate the trade-offs between raising and purchasing. So if you're going to purchase less labor for your employees or yourself, less feed, time management, etc. But there's also a really big risk of introducing disease into your herd. And in our state, it's especially important to consider because each island is its own bubble, and there are diseases on one island that might not be on another, and it's especially important to consider this when bringing in replacement females from the mainland. So that's something to always consider. But I know many producers in the state of Hawaii don't have a lot of options when it comes to purchasing replacement heifers, so many people will be raising their own replacements. And it's really important to evaluate the costs and remember that your input costs for your replacement heifers are going to be a little bit higher because they are an investment and you need to treat them that way. These are your next generation of females, and so it's important that you are giving them superior nutrition, you're paying attention to their growth and development, and you're treating them a little bit differently than you would your older cow herd. It's always important to remember that your future profit is going to be reflected in these females, and this is an investment that will not have a return for many, many years, and most likely you're going to be keeping these females around for an extended period of time. So it's important that when you are considering which heifers you're going to keep back, that you really critically evaluate them. When you're coming at the end of your calving season and maybe coming up to weaning and you're thinking that, hey, I think I want to keep some replacement heifers this year, cull out some older cows, whatever the reasoning might be, most likely every calving season you're going to be keeping back some replacement females. And it's important to evaluate these females at multiple points of their lives. I think the first is going to be weaning. You're going to be assessing just your first impressions of this female or even the genetic history of the cow or docility or things like that. And I'll get into more details in later slides. But then you're going to follow up maybe from that weaning to first breeding or essentially a yearling evaluation. And then, of course, probably 3 and 4 are going to be the most important, and that's how do they perform from a reproductive standpoint. I believe that a heifer that fails to meet any of your production goals at any of these points should be culled immediately. You do not want to waste time with a female that is not going to produce for you. How they perform at the beginning of their lives is going to reflect their long-term productivity and longevity in your herd for many, many years to come. So if they are not meeting your standards as a first and second calf heifer, then they should be culled. There's no reason to keep females around in your herd that are not going to be beneficial for your operation. It's a pretty cutthroat thought process, but we always need to remember that our beef operations are our business, and we need to make sure that the animals that we are feeding and caring for are essentially earning their keep. So I have kind of some initial culling parameters that you could probably look at before really critically evaluating the female. And the first is obviously heifers from poor performing cows. We won't get into why these poor performing cows are even in your herd in the first place at this point, But let's just say you have a batch of heifers from some poor performing cows. So maybe they're inconsistent in their conception. Maybe they miss a calf every so often, or they're late calvers, which means they're late breeders. Or maybe they're cows that are requiring you to get the calf puller out. And it might not be every year, but every once in a while you're having to assist these calves or assist these cows at calving. And those are not females that you should have in your herd in the first place. And those are definitely females that you don't want to be keeping their offspring. We do not want to be out there pulling calves, having late calving cows, or not being able to count on these females to get pregnant every single year. So if you have a heifer that's from a cow that has never been a good or easy keeping female, then that's a heifer that you would ship off and either place into your grass finish operation or ship to the mainland. The next would be disposition. And docility is genetic. It's also environmental. It's important to understand that their behavior can be learned, and their poor response to their environment could be because of poor handling techniques. So it's always important that you utilize low stress handling techniques, but the docility is something that can be genetic. It's really important to call those flighty or high-headed females or females from mean cows. Um, the last is kind of a no-brainer, but it's important to remember that heifers with a bull twin are free martins and they're almost always sterile. So it's important to just not even mess with those females and cull them. Just basically any poor doers that are just obvious from bad genetics should be culled. It's not worth the investment of your time or your resources to try to get these females through a first and second calf. We all have those females that are like this gal here. This was a feedlot heifer from my feedlot days, and you can see she's high-headed here. She's bug-eyed. She's just super hot, and that's probably why she ended up in our feedlot and not as a replacement heifer. So get rid of those bottom tier females that are just easy to cull right out of the gate. To get into more detail on selection based off the dam, I'm going to talk about this in a couple of slides, but the first is to know the genetic history. And that might not necessarily be as detailed as knowing their EPDs or having a pedigree, although I think that is something very important to pay attention to, and that is a discussion and talk for another time. But you should know your females, and you should know the cows and their family. So cow X was from cow Y, and she was from cow Z, and they've always just been a good, easy keeping cow family. Those are the females that you want to keep back for replacements. It's important to know that they come from a long line of easy keeping, good performing females. It's a no-brainer, but good cows produce good replacement heifers. And we should also be paying attention to their maternal and mothering ability. So when we talk about maternal traits, if you're breeding, let's say if you're going to breed for replacement heifers, you're going to be wanting to select bulls that have good maternal traits. So that would be things like calving ease, birth weight, milk, those sorts of things. And if you have any questions on any of this, feel free to contact me or your county agent, and we can help you with the nitty-gritty details on this. But knowing that genetic history of that bull when you're breeding for replacement heifers is really important. The quickest way to improve your whole herd genetics is to find the best bull for your production goals and to breed to those animals and then select those females for replacement. That's the quickest way you're going to see an improvement in your whole herd of genetics. Once you have all your replacement heifers and you're breeding for terminal offspring or offspring that you're going to ship off to the mainland or place into a grass finishing, that's when you would look at a bull that has those quote unquote terminal traits. And a lot of those are carcass characteristics, weight gain, all of those various different EPDs. And if these aren't pedigreed bulls, then just know the genetic history. You may not have the ability or technology to be AIing or buying semen, or even buying, purebred, highly rated bulls, but you still should have a good grasp of that genetic history. Then a little bit of selection based on the dam, and this is kind of where I like to get in the weeds on, because for those of you who don't know, I actually come from a mixed dairy and beef background, and so I was on a judging team for Michigan State and for Michigan 4-H, and I judged dairy cows, and so I learned to have a very, very sharp eye for good udder and good, powerful females. And it's something that I've carried through in my selection and when assessing beef cows. And there are extremes in the dairy industry that I won't get into, but the udder is kind of overlooked a lot of times. And so it is really important to make sure that you're evaluating the udders of the dams that potential replacement heifers are out of. So in this top right corner here, we have what we call the udder cleft, or the median suspensory ligament is the fancy term for it. But it's essentially that central ligament that is holding the two halves of the udder up and in place. And so if you don't know, the udder has 4 quarters. So you've got multiple ligaments that kind of separate each quarter, but then that median suspensory ligament is what's going to keep that udder nice and tight to the body wall. So you can see in picture number 1 on that top right photo that you've got a nice, well-defined udder cleft. And because of that, the teats are sitting really nicely. They're straight down. That udder is really tight to the body wall. But as you go and move to the right all the way into number 4, you've got basically no definition, no visible udder cleft, a very loose attachment, and you have teats that are going in all different directions, which can make it hard for the calf to suckle. Additionally, having a poorly attached udder opens up the doors for the udder to essentially hang really low, increase risk of injury to the teats if it gets stepped on. Closer, if it hangs low and is closer to the ground, you've got an increased risk of contamination to the udder and possibly mastitis. And the more calves you run through these females, the looser that those udder attachments are going to get. So when you're selecting for your replacement heifers, you want to make sure that the females that they're from are having really, really strong attachments and good quality udders that have stood the test of time. In the bottom left figure, it's looking at different teat sizes, and so there's actually a teat score, or an udder score, but I won't get into too much of that with you. But you really want to make sure that you have nice cylindrical uniform teats. We like to call these number 5 teats balloon teats, or they're too big. It's hard for the calf to suckle. Risk of injury. That longer teat canal is more risk of infection, more risk of mastitis. And so we really want to try to keep our teats in that 1 to 2 range. And then lastly, on figure 3, which is there in the bottom right, that's going to be looking at fore-udder attachment. And that fore-udder attachment is what's going to keep the udder attached to the body wall closer to the rib cage, versus that udder cleft in that top right picture is what keeps it close to the body wall in the rear. This is what's going to keep it from having different types of tilts or kind of dropping down in the front end of the udder. And so you can see in that number 5, you've got a really low hanging bag. I mean, this cow looks like she's 20 years old. and you don't want to have, you don't want to be keeping heifers out of dams that have bags that look like that. So once you've kind of evaluated and culled, the females that are out of poor doing cows, that have cows with bad udders, bad dispositions, kind of your obvious easy culls, I like to look at weaning selection. And these criteria that I'm going to talk about here are something that you should be evaluating these females for continuously. Because their bodies are going to change. And sometimes those differences are easier to see when they're closer to that yearling age versus weaning. And so it is important to practice these techniques and to train your eye to be able to tell the difference. And so a lot of these things are, they're very, very up for interpretation. They are each person is going to evaluate differently. And so the best recommendation I can make to you as a producer is, instead of trying to just select one and have blinders on, and only look at that one female, is to do more of a comparative type of criteria. So you need to be comparing all of your females. Keep the top, get rid of the bottom kind of mentality. And so before you even start looking at these nitty-gritty criteria, you need to understand what your production goals are. So for some of you, that might be that these females are going to be bred to bulls that are going to have calves that you're going to put into a feedlot on the mainland. And so that means that you're most likely going to be selecting for big framed, easy keeping, large bodied offspring, because that's what the mainland market desires. Our finished animals are getting larger and larger, and our slaughterhouses are able to handle larger carcasses. And so what you're going to select for your replacement heifers is going to be very different from someone who is selecting replacement heifers for a grass finish operation. And so typically in a grass finish operation, you're going to want a smaller framed animal that will finish quicker, so that they can be more competitive with conventionally or grain-based, feedlot-based animals that finish quicker. So frame size, that's going to be strictly based on your production goals. I recommend culling the extremes. You don't want that teeny tiny, kind of runt of the group. You also don't want that totally massive female, because eventually you're going to start breeding for larger animals, and you could run into some calving ease issues. When it comes to structure, I'm very, very picky about structure, and that includes having the correct angles of all of your joints, width throughout, and your feet and legs. So we will talk about those in the following slides, but we want to make sure that your females are going to stand the test of time, and if they don't have good structure, they're not going to be able to handle some of the rough environments that Hawaii has to offer. I know some of you guys have pastures that are very high in elevation, and those cows will rotate through pastures that are low in elevation, that might be rocky, that might be hilly, rugged terrain. So these females need to be built to last. So when we talk about feet and legs, I like to talk about the flex to their hock, their the straightness of their feet and how well they track when they're on the move. I like to talk about their toes and making sure that they have correct feet. And then I also like to look at pasterns. And so in your top left picture here, it's looking at that flex in your hock. And so in dairy cows, we tend to see a lot of flex and a lot of really, really poor pasterns and weak pasterns. But it is really important when you're looking at replacement beef calves, especially on a rugged terrain, that you've got enough flex in that hock, like that top left corner. And if you are comparing and you've got a really straight-legged female and a more of a sickle hocked, I would lean towards a female with a little bit more flex or more bend to that hock than something that's too straight, because that straightness is going to make it very difficult in the long term for her to move with these. In the bottom left corner, we're basically just looking at how straight that these legs are going to track. So you don't want them to toe in, and you don't want them to toe out. So you don't want to be bow-legged or cow-hocked, and that's just a longevity situation. You want them to track really straight. So it's important to look at your females while they're standing still, but also see how they are on the move. The top right is getting really nitty gritty, but you want to make sure that you've got nice shape to your toes. You don't want them to be too large or grown out or scissor clawed, because we don't trim hooves in the beef industry. In the dairy industry, they do, so they can be a little bit more forgiving since you're going to come in and have someone correct some of those poor feet issues. But for your beef cows, you don't have time to be looking at that. They need to be able to hold their own in whatever environment. And then lastly, looking at your pasterns, which is kind of that space between the dew claw there and the hoof, and you want them to have the correct angle, and that's kind of like a little bit of a 45-degree angle here. You can see in that middle picture, you got the dew claws that are almost about to touch the ground, and that is a classical. We see that all the time in dairy cows. We do not want to see that. We want to make sure we have a nice shape, and we have really strong pasterns. Next, when we're looking at the correct angles, this is a very obvious show animal. So I know that you guys are not going to have heifers in your herd that look like this. These are from some 4-H or stock shows of what we call club calves where I'm from. But this female really is a good representation of some really nice angles that I like to see. The first is going to be that blue 1 to 2, and that's going to be the angles from your hip to the hock, or some people call it your hooks to your hock, and that's going to be that first big bone right there. Behind there, the bones that are around the tail head, those are going to be your pins. You want to make sure you have a nice angle from your hip to your hock. You want to avoid too much straightness, because the straightness is, again, she's going to have trouble on the move over time. And then you want to make sure you've got enough flex to your hock, which we talked about already. From the front end, we want to see good angles from your shoulders. So we tend to see some cows and some breeds tend to get a little straight shouldered. But we do want to make sure we've got enough of that 45-degree angle from the shoulders, and then also making sure that you've got correct angles from your shoulder to your knee, and then your knee to that front pastern. Another thing we talk about is your top line. So you want a nice straight top, and then also we look at that angle and the width between your hooks and your pins from the side. So that's going to be I will get my little marker on here. That's going to be the width between your hips here and your pins here. And so in beef cows, we tend to want a relatively level angle from the hips to the pins. I like a little bit of angle because it's going to help with the calving ease, but the straightness from hooks to pins or from hips to pins is often indicative of the overall width of that hip, which can also play into calving ease. The biggest thing you want to avoid is high pins, which is, that backbone there being really, really high, because that is going to be you're opening a can of worms with all kinds of structure issues. So after you've evaluated the structure, I like to look at their fleshing ability. Obviously, you are going to be breeding these replacement females for beef production. A wide, powerful female can not only handle a larger calf, but she will produce large, powerful calves, which is essential in both feedlot and grass finish performance. I prefer an average female. We don't want something that's overly fleshy, because she will be uneconomical. She may be hard to keep, and she'll be expensive to feed. And then something that I picked up from my dairy years, is just that big, powerful body capacity and volume and rib. And then, of course, we want good muscling, because we don't want these females to be frail, because we want them to be producing good quality beef animals. So when we're looking at some examples here, and we'll get into some videos later, which I think will be really helpful. But this top left is what I like to call a snake or a tube animal, and this is a steer, so ignore that. But this is a really great example of a shallow-ribbed, narrow animal, and we want to avoid that at all costs in our replacement females. This steer is really short-bodied. That width between the flank and the knee there, that's a really short-bodied animal. And we want a nice long and wide-bodied female. And why is that? I know you guys can't answer back since this is a pre-recorded webinar. Normally, if it was a live audience, I'd make you all sit in silence until somebody answered. But, think about for a second. Why do we want a longer, wider animal for our replacement females? That's because there's going to be more product on their calves. Okay? So a longer carcass, a wider carcass, is more room for muscle to be deposited on these carcasses, which means you're going to have more product per animal hanging on the rail whenever their offspring go to slaughter. So we really want to select for those really long-bodied females. This heifer here on the top right, she's still a little bit too shallow. And when I'm referring to shallow, I'm referring from that from her top line all the way there down to her belly and her rear and fore ribs. You want that to be really deep. You want her to have a lot of space between her top line and her belly. And then in that left picture, we want to see a lot of spring to her rib, or a lot of width in that rib. This bottom left heifer is a little fat, I will admit, but she is a really deep-bodied female. I mean, check that out. I mean, comparing to these top two animals. I mean, woof. She's got a lot of depth to her rib. And then you look at this replacement heifer over here on the right, and these are club calves. These are going to be, show animals. They're not commercial females. But you'll see there she's got a lot of width and spring to the rib. And when I say spring, I mean that is kind of that arch of the ribs that kind of makes a C shape. And you want them to be wide. You want them to have a nice good C shape. And then and this is really nitty-gritty in dairy cows, and it's hard to see sometimes in beef cows, but you also want a lot of width between the ribs, and that's what we call spring of rib. And that's that width in between each individual rib, and you want there to be as much as possible. So this here is looking at a more typical class of breeding heifers. These are commercial females that you would see in a typical cow-calf operation. I know I was showing you guys a lot of clubby looking calves, and I know that that's unrealistic to what we have here in Hawaii, but they do a nice job of showing the extremes of what we want to see. And so I want you guys to take a moment. You guys can pause the video. I'll give a couple seconds, and I just want you to assess these females. Look at their frame, look at their width and power, look at how their feet track, and which one do you think you would cull, and which one do you think you would keep? In this class, there's an easy keeper, and there's a very obvious one that you would want to cull. So I give you guys a couple minutes to kind of look at that, and you guys can pause this video. I really recommend you take the time to pause this and really evaluate versus just hitting play and listening to me explain it to you, because it's important to try to evaluate on your own. And again, we're going to have videos coming up too where you can see animals on the move. Okay, so I'm assuming you've just paused it, um, and you assessed them and you just hit play. And so for me, we've got a really, really, really obvious bottom, and that's going to be that number 3 female. Number 3, she's the shallowest bodied. She's really tight in her flank. You can see there. Um, she's kind of the hardest fleshing. I would say she's the least muscled out of all these females, and she's really short bodied, and she's just kind of a poor doer. I mean, she's got some funky feet, and she's just small, and she's not one that I would want to keep. Um, and then after that, I thought we had a pretty obvious uh, top female, and that was going to be number 4. And number 4 is just powerful. She's easy fleshing. You can already see she's the best muscled female. She's neater in that shoulder, and so a good example would be you can kind of see how 1 is kind of coarse, how her shoulder kind of pops out like that. You really want to see a female that's body parts kind of blend really smoothly together. You want there to be a nice flow of parts. In judging, we used to say that she blends smoothly throughout. And so that's what we want to see, is we want to see a well-made female that her parts just blend. And she's really neat in all of her parts. And then you can see here she tracks really straight. We can't see her on the move, but you can see, her toes are pointed really straight versus 3. Her toes kind of kick out there. She's a little cowhocked. And then for me, 1 and 2 are 2 completely different animals. And they're a pretty close middle. It just depends on maybe your production goals. I think 1 is more powerful. Than the number 2 female here. I think that, um, or excuse me, I'm sorry. I think that number 2 is going to be kind of that thinner, more narrow-made female. She's a little bit shorter bodied, but she's a little bit more feminine looking. So maybe you're looking to pull some of those feminine traits out of there. Um, it kind of depends on your production goals. You can see 1 might be more powerful, but she kind of breaks in her top line there. So she's got some frame issues. So those 2 are going to be kind of a draw on what you want to improve on your herd, whether you want a more powerful, you want a more correct animal. That's just going to be preference. But I would cull 3, keep 4, and then evaluate 1 and 2 based on what your animals look like in your herd and where you want to make those improvements. So moving into a yearling heifer evaluation, everything I just talked about should be reevaluated whenever they're at breeding age. There's a lot of discussion over breeding age. Some people choose to breed at 14 to 15 months. Some people choose to wait. If you have Brahman influence cattle, they tend to be late maturing, so they might not be mature enough to breed at 14, 15 months. You might want to wait until they're a little bit older. So it's all going to be based on your own preference. Most people are going to stick to that early breeding because the quicker you can get these heifers pregnant, the quicker they can start producing. And if you wait too long, they have trouble breeding during the next breeding season. And that is also going to determine, or that's going to be based if you're doing a seasonal or year-round breeding. And I know there's a lot of folks here that have their bull turned out year-round, and it is difficult to control your breeding season and select replacements when you have the bull turned out year-round, because looking at some of those reproduction characteristics is going to be difficult. But I'm going to want to look at your frame score, body condition scoring. You want to make sure these heifers have nice cover or nice muscling and fat because they're going to be coming up on a really challenging and nutritionally challenging time of their lives, supporting a calf and then eventually lactation. Weighing, I think investing in ways to collect data on your herd is the best investment you can make. If you can't put a number to it, you can't track it, and you can't improve it. If you can't weigh it, you don't know. So investing in a scale or even a weigh tape or something like that is really important. And then looking at, the different weaning criterias. Another great tool, there's two tools that I'm going to tell you guys about that are often used on the mainland, especially if you're a seed stock producer or you have, really high quality genetics and you're really trying to select the ones that are going to be the best. And that's going to be looking at pelvic area and then reproductive tract scores. I will say before I even go into these that it is not something that you should do without prior training. There's probably limited people that know how to do this. Um, I'm not entirely sure if vets are trained on pelvic area measurements and reproductive tract scores. Most likely not. They're probably more equipped with doing preg checking. But there are some people around the state that are trained to do these things. And I would recommend just reaching out to anyone with an extension, and we can try to put you in touch with some of these folks if you think that you're ready for this next level. But basically, the pelvic area is a way to measure a female's ability to calve without any issues with dystocia. And dystocia is basically any issues with birthing, where you're going to have to pull a calf, rotate a calf, get your hands in there and assist that female. And that's looking just at that area there between the two hip bones. And based on the pelvic area you can see in this chart, you can estimate how big the calf will be, or how big a calf they can handle without assistance. I know that this is something that not everyone will be able to do. Not even everyone has the right chute to be able to safely do pelvic areas. And so another great way to do it is looking at the overall width in that rear end of that female. So that's looking at your hip width, and that's looking at pin width. And wider is always better. Always select the wider female. And then the other thing is looking at reproductive tract scoring, and that's looking at all the different ovarian structures. So that's looking at follicles. That's kind of palpating the uterine horns, palpating the ovaries, and it takes a lot of skill to be able to do this. So do not try to do it on your own. It is important that someone train you on this, or you bring someone in that can do this for you. And I know that this is not feasible for everybody, but these are useful tools that can be valuable if you're ready to be on that next level. So this is my favorite moment, and these are four heifers. We're going to assume these are all the same age. I'm going to play the videos, and I'm going to wait a couple seconds, and then I'm going to pretend like you hit paused, and then we're going to talk about these four females. So these are four females from a ranch here in the state. They donated and sent these videos to me so that I could use it for an example. And so I think it's really good to be able to look at animals here in the state that have kind of a body type that we would typically see. Of course, this female's very motivated by her pasture, so she's not going to move for you, but she's showing off a little bit. Kind of seeing a little bit of that rear angle, that nice side angle. Okay. And then we've got this number 2. We're going to call the top left is number 1. The top right will be our number 2 female. Obviously, we have no issues here with docility or high-headed heifers. Then we're looking at the bottom left one now, which we'll call female number 3. I know she's kind of trying to walk away a little bit, but she gives us a nice side profile. And I'll do that one more time so you guys can see that side side profile there. And then this number 4, this white face. She's definitely very friendly. Okay, so I want you to pause and to think, and I want you to tell me which one, or not tell me because you can't tell me, but I want you to think about which one you would call right off. I mean, it should take you 5 seconds, if that, to determine which one you would call. Again, we are assuming these are all the same age, so they were all born within the same calving season. Okay, so I'm hoping that everyone is choosing this number 3 heifer to call. Again, like I said, we're assuming that these are all the same age. This heifer might actually be younger, but we are evaluating them all as if they were born right within the same, 30 to 60 day period. And number 3 is the smallest. She's the most frail. You can see here she's really shallow bodied. She's pretty short bodied. You can't, there we go. Now you can see kind of the width there. She's just small. She would be one of those ones that just call right away. She just we've got 3 other really nice females here. If you could only keep 3, you can only keep 2. This number 3 heifer would be who I would send off. Next, I feel like there's a very easy top heifer that I would keep, and it's not just because I have a preference for white-faced heifers, because I definitely do, but that's this number 4 heifer here. And you can see she's just a big, powerful. She's really easily muscled. You can see a lot of muscle on her. She's really wide. If we can kind of see her from the front end, we can see how wide she is there. She's got a lot of rib on her. She's real deep. She's just going to be an easy keeping, powerful female, a good brood cow. And then when you look at 1 and 2, they're very similarly made heifers. So these top 2 heifers. 1 is going to be a little bit longer bodied. So she's stopped at a really, but you can see 1 is a slightly longer bodied female. And 2 is kind of a smaller framed female. But I think that they're both very similar, both really nice females, that you could probably flip a coin on which one to keep on these 2. I'd probably go back to looking at genetic history of their dams. So thank you to the rancher who knows who these animals are for donating these videos to me. They're really helpful. I know we would all much rather be out in a pasture evaluating heifers in person, but we have all these great new technologies, and so it's nice to be able to put this recording up for everyone to see at a later time. I'm going to go through. So then, of course, the most important, but the ones that I'm just going to probably breeze through, because at this point, this should be something that most of you guys are already evaluating. That's going to be during first breeding and first calving. Depending on your breeding strategy, which I highly recommend trying to look at your seasonal breeding, just because it's going to be way easier for you to evaluate these things. You can evaluate these things if you're doing year-round and your bulls turned out year-round. It just requires really, really a close eye on your females and seeing, when they breed, when you think they're pregnant again, if you see them in standing heat, things like that. So I recommend you preg check heifers. You can preg check by palpation 60 to 90 days after you remove the bull. Some really good preg checkers with a really good hand can get that like 30 to 45 day. But 60 to 90 days after removing the bull, you're going to be able to preg check the heifers. And I'm very, very cutthroat when it comes to first calf heifers. If they don't breed during your breeding season, which normally is 2 cycles, then I would call them. We're way more lenient when we do those second calf heifers, but your first calf heifers, they should be getting pregnant. Your breeding season might be 60, maybe 70 days. There's no reason why they shouldn't get pregnant, provided that you have nice bulls and good coverage on those females. Uh, Pregnancy rates will drop significantly if they're open at the first breeding and maybe you decide to hold them over for a second breeding 6 months later. There's some data out there on some Heifers and some Brangus and some slightly Brahmin influenced females that their pregnancy rates can drop from anywhere from 63 to 47% pregnancy rates or conception rates if you wait 6 months later. So if let's say you turn them out at 14 to 15 months and you wait then to 18 months to rebreed and you let them be open and try to catch them again your next breeding season, your pregnancy rates are going to plummet. So I would not give them a second chance because that is just going to be something that is going to keep becoming an issue. You can also blood test, which might be easier than palpating if you know how to pull blood. You can send blood tests out and do the pregnancy testing that way, and they can actually catch it 30 days. So if you have a short calving season or you want to catch your early calving or your early breeding females, some people want to save and keep back the replacement heifers that catch in that first 28-day breeding period. Then you can do the blood testing, and you can reach out to any of the extension agents on your islands or even to your vets, and they can talk to you about the blood testing. But blood testing is something you don't need to really require. You don't need to have a skill to know how to do, and you can easily send those off. It can get a little expensive, so I would probably blood test if you're trying to look at some good quality replacement heifers. Also, your late breeding females are going to spend the first half of the next breeding season trying to recover from calving versus being ready to breed, and they will always be behind because they will always end up being the way the cycle works. We typically will try to turn bulls out at least 60 days after calving, and those bulls will maybe be out for a 70 to 90 day period or maybe a little less depending on how stringent you want to be. And if they're a late calving female versus your early calving female, you might wait 60 days for your early calving, but that might only end up being like 30 days from those late calving females after they calve to before the bull turns out. And so they're going to be recovering. It's going to take them longer to come back into heat, and they're going to, again, be late breeders, and it's just going to be a continuous cycle. It's really hard for those females to catch back up. It's also important to remember that these first calf heifers are still growing during their first pregnancy, so you need to be sure you're providing adequate nutrition and you're evaluating their body condition score. I will talk about body condition scoring, I think, on the next slide, but you don't want heifers to get too thin, especially right before calving, because it's hard for them to catch up with that weight during lactation. Which means they might be skinny whenever you go to rebreed. And we all know how hard it is to get those second calf heifers rebred. So we want to make sure we're crossing our T's and dotting our I's when it comes to our body condition of our females, especially for the second calf heifers. And then, I'd like you to observe their mothering ability or their calf growth and their milk production. A good way to assess their good replacement heifer is to assess her offspring. If she throws poor offspring or she can't maintain her body condition or she can't raise that calf well, then she's not a female that you want to keep in your herd. So this is a body condition scoring that's pulled from the BIF page or the Beef Improvement page. They're kind of the genetic go-tos organization when it comes to genetic improvement of beef cattle. But I recommend assessing body condition score 2 months prior to calving. Some people tend to assess body condition score right at calving or right after calving. But you have to remember that they are going to be facing a lot of nutritional challenges right after calving because they're going to start lactating and putting a lot of energy and nutrition into producing milk. And so if you notice your cows are too skinny right at calving, it's going to be a pretty hard uphill battle, and you're going to spend a lot of money supplementing those females to get them to the body condition score you want them to be at rebreeding. So if you assess body condition score like 2 months before calving, it'll allow you to have adequate time to put on weight if needed. We want those heifers to be at a body condition score of 5 or 6 before calving to ensure that they'll maintain that body condition score through lactation and set them up for success at rebreeding. So we really, if you have too thin, if you get them into that 3 and even 4 2 months before calving, they're going to be super railed off by the time you rebreed. And, it's slim chances that you're going to be able to rebreed those second calf heifers. So give them every opportunity they need to succeed from a reproductive standpoint. And for those of you that know me, you know I'm a nutrition person. I'm a ruminant nutritionist by training, and so nutrition is everything. An animal will never perform the way that their genetics are set up to if they don't have the correct nutrition. So some yearling or breeding and calving benchmarks, a lot of people like to look at weights. I think that's maybe less common if you don't have access to a scale. Again, like I said, if you can't measure it, you can't track it, and you can't improve it. So weigh your females. They should be at about 65% of that mature body weight at breeding, and they should be at about 85% at calving. So if that works out, that you vaccinate a certain time, or you're working cattle at a certain time, you can run them across the scale, that's great. You can also use a weigh tape. We all know how difficult those can be, so ideally a scale would be the best. But a weigh tape is an option if you don't have the overhead to invest in a scale. So rebreeding and first calf performance, like I already mentioned, the key to timely rebreeding and a successful rebreeding is going to be that body condition. We want to make sure that they have adequate body condition before breeding. We want to make sure that they have proper nutrition as well. And the first step of proper nutrition is going to be, protein and energy. It's where you're going to see the most significant impacts of reproductive performance. But you also need to make sure you're paying attention to those micro and macro minerals in your vitamins. And so there should be some sort of mineral and vitamin pack that you're giving to these animals, whether it's a block, whether it's a tub, whether it's loose mineral. And if you have questions on minerals, I literally studied it for 2 years with beef cows. That is my niche, and I would be happy to help find a mineral that would work great for your operation. But the one thing I can recommend is look at the label. If it has any form of oxide at the end of the mineral, it's like a copper oxide or a zinc oxide, those are the most poorly absorbed minerals. So they're basically their ability to reabsorb those minerals, the cow's ability to absorb those minerals is very, very low. So anything with the oxides in there is going to be what we call poor bioavailability, or poor ability to be actually utilized by the animal. And then cull heifers that don't rebreed. Most people will give second calf heifers a couple of tries. And I think you can be more forgiving on those second calf heifers. Do not be that forgiving on your first calf heifers. And then observe that calf performance. Look at their weaning weights. Look at how they perform. Look at their average daily gain. That's going to be a reflection of that cow's milking ability and that cow's ability to throw a high performing calf. So remember, the calf is a reflection of the heifer. So poor calf is a poor heifer, and I would cull. Just a couple of notes on rebreeding. Remember that extended time of lactation can disrupt or delay estrus. So we want to make sure that you don't have these calves on their mothers for too long. You want to make sure we're getting them weaned off. And then again, I already mentioned this, but a minimum of 60 days after calving to rebreed. And then my last plug, which I'm sure you guys have noticed I've pushed quite a bit, is nutrition. And you can buy the most expensive heifer. You can buy the most expensive straw of semen. You can buy that $60 straw of semen. You can buy sex semen. You can buy the nicest bull in all the world. But these females in your animals will never reach their genetic potential if their nutritional needs aren't met. You need to make sure that you've got these animals meeting their protein, energy, and all their mineral requirements. Also important to watch your magnesium because there's an increased demand for that during lactation. But just a general mineral pack or mineral mix should work for you. Before you start investing money into genetic improvement, before you start buying new bulls or buying replacement heifers or stringently selecting replacement heifers, anytime you're going to think about investing money and dollars and cents into genetic improvement, you better make sure that your nutrition and your health management are up to par. Make sure your cows are getting all the nutrients they need and that you've got a good vaccination, deworming, and health plan. And I recommend that you work with an extension agent and also a veterinarian that, the extension agent and vet might only need to come out once a year to assess things and come up with a plan and then update that plan as you need. It's the best investment you can make way before you invest in a nice bull or nice semen. So with that, I will tell you that remember that your heifers are the future. Choose wisely, be tough, and have no mercy when it comes to selecting those replacements. And if you have any questions, I recommend that you email me. My email is Katulski, Katulski @hawaii.edu. I'll have it posted on this website, and then it's posted at the beginning of this video. Thanks so much, and feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions.